and welcome to February and another month of episodes with royals, rebels, and romantics. A few reminders, of course. Don't forget to get your copy of the Tudors by Numbers, which you can now order right from my website, carolann.lloyd.com. I'd be very happy to sign and dedicate that book to you or the history lover in your life. And coming soon, I'm going to be having a cover reveal and some pre publication news about my upcoming book, Courting the Virgin Queen. I also want to remind you, as it's February and that's the month of Valentine's Day here in the US, we will be launching our first Royals and Rebels and Romantics ebook. And our first theme will be the top 10 lovers among the Royals, the Rebels, and the Romantics. So think about who you might choose among those top 10. And my patrons get to vote on the number one lover. So lots of exciting things happening this month. And I'm even more delighted to let you know we have another wonderful episode coming up right now.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with Judith Arnopp, and we are holding up our copies. Mine is on Kindle, hers is real, live, actual, of her wonderful book, How to Dress Like a Tudor. So hopefully you're on YouTube, but if you're listening, think of the cover. It's so marvelous. And I wanted us to just start by holding these up because the idea of Tudor dressing is so important and the visual is so important. So we're going to put our books down now so our arms don't just totally go to sleep. But welcome, Judith. I am delighted to have you here on the podcast. And I want to just ask a few questions. And the first thing I like to ask people is, what got you interested in history?
It was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I was still at school, first year of senior school, and my English teacher lent me a book about Henry VIII. It was a novel. I think it might have been Here Comes the King or something like that. And then after that, I read everything there is about Henry VIII, or there was then, about Henry VIII and his wives and his parents. And then I went back into the Middle Ages and read about Richard III and the Wars of the Roses and anything really. But I couldn't afford books then because we didn't have Kindle, obviously, because this is 1971. So pocket money didn't stretch to buying books. So I used to go in the bookshop and just hang out every lunchtime and read another chapter. And when they clocked what I was doing, they put a stop to that, which wasn't very fair because we had a library, but they didn't have the newest books quick enough.
Right. Well, if it seems like a lot of people start with a great teacher. And so it sounds like you had somebody who let you have a book and about Henry VIII, and Henry VIII's kind of a big entry into the Tudor world. And that seems to be a place you're still interested. You've mentioned, you and I were talking earlier, that you're also interested in Richard III. So that whole Wars of the Roses Tudor time period, right?
I like transitional periods. So how people were before, and then how they got through the transition and how they survived afterwards. So all those periods, Norman Conquest.
Oh, okay.
Even World War I and II, anything where society takes a blow. And
okay. Oh, that's really interesting. And the Tudors, if you think about going from Richard III to the Tudors, that was a pretty big transition. And sometimes we don't remember as much about Henry VII, the first Tudor. We just kind of jump right into Henry VIII. But something you mentioned in your book that I was really interested in was the difference in dress in particular. So the book is How to Dress Like a Tudor. And Henry VII dressed very differently from his son. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think sometimes we just kind of zoom past Henry VII, but he was the first Tudor. So what was his dress like?
I don't think Henry was particularly interested in fashion. I think he was much more politically focused. But I mean, he came at the tail end of the medieval period, so it was all very drapey and soft and probably very comfortable and warm. So by the time Henry came along, and it was all about showing off his magnificence, the comfort went out the window, and the clothes from his reign are not comfortable. I've worn clothes from both reigns, and although they're still very warm, because I don't suffer with the cold, but they're very warm medieval clothes, and so are Tudor clothes, layers and layers, and they're heavy. The earlier ones were far more comfortable.
Oh, that's really interesting. So if you think about Henry VII and his reign, he was interested in looking his best and looking kingly, but it was a more comfortable, as you say, drapey, longer.
He wore the best fabrics that were available, but they were quite muted. Unlike Henry, he was really blingy because, I don't know, it's like as if they were trying to establish their authority and say, look at me, I'm excellent.
Yes, and magnificence is a term we hear a lot with Henry VIII, right? So he really wanted to look magnificent. And one of the things I noticed in something like the family portrait he did at Whitehall, where you see Henry VII in the longer, his cloak goes all the way to the ground, and then you see Henry VIII, and
sexy legs.
It shows off his legs. That's really interesting to me. Why he seemed very proud of his legs and his calves.
It was an important thing to men in those days to have a good physique. It showed how good you were in the saddle, because you get good calf muscles in the saddle, and he had good legs. So if you've got it, flaunt it, I guess.
Yes. So his gowns were shorter to show off his legs, which is a pretty dramatic difference from Henry VII to Henry VIII.
Well, they went with Henry VII, probably older and more indoorsy, so didn't need to move about so much. I think one of the most interesting things you can see the transition of from that period is in the gabled hoods. If you look at the hoods that Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth York were wearing, they've just got a gentle peak at the front, but they're quite soft, and not really very extravagant at all, just modest with a little. And but then later on, by the time we get to Catherine of Aragon, it's a proper roof. I mean, you're wearing a small house on your head by that point.
Right. And there's more space to show off the jewels, right? If you have the bigger, as you say, almost a roof up there, you can really show off some bling, right?
Things up there, yeah. True, I hadn't thought of that.
So we have this time where we go from sort of a quieter Henry VII, still the best fabric and really elegant, and his mother and his wife just with the softer, still gable, but softer hoods that they're wearing. And then you get to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And by then there are a lot of jewels and a lot of cloth and the just the scope. And of course, Henry VIII was not gigantic at first, but he was very tall and broad-shouldered, which his father was not. And so he was really showing off his physique, and he chose clothing to show that off. So you see those two kings at the beginning, and I think we do learn a lot. Henry VIII continues to get sort of bigger and bigger, and his shoulders get bigger. So what would that have been like? As his, his portraits, these shoulders, he sort of bursts out of the frame.
Yeah, that's not all him, though. I mean, he was a big man, but he had a lot of padding. All his underclothes, not his underclothes, his doublet and everything would be padded. And then the coat itself had wires in the sleeves to make them stand out big and poofy like that. So he wasn't as big as he appears.
Right.
And, I don't know, maybe as he got bigger, he thought it disguised things, but initially it was to emphasize his largeness rather than try and disguise it.
Right. So he wanted to really appear shoulder wise bigger and bigger. Eventually his waist really catches up with that and takes over. But I really was interested in having you explain how the wires were used, because often we think about women who are wearing skirts and they wear something under to make the skirts stand out. But I don't think we pay as much attention or understand as well that if you look at those portraits of Henry, he's also got almost a little cage holding up.
And Elizabeth and Mary.
Yes, yes.
In there. Yeah, it was like, well, I've made Henry VIII costume. I mean, it's not as lovely as some you see, because I don't have the budget for a start. But it's just wire, and it's run through a casing of like bias binding on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
You run it through a channel and bend it to the shape, and there you are. So
I just think it's so interesting. They were crafting the way they looked in so many different ways. And then you have that extra fabric. And again, he liked to have a lot of bling, as you mentioned. Tell us a little bit about, we're going to get to Mary and Elizabeth in just a sec, but let's stick with good old Henry for a minute here. What kind of bling, what kind of showing off do you really see with him through his clothing?
Well, the fabric for a start would cost a fortune, and the quantity of fabric. So he didn't skimp in anything. There's yards and yards in his coat, and his doublet and everything, and the silk and underwear that shows through the slashes on the doublet. All that was, out of most people's pockets.
Right. So all those details allow him to really present himself as the top guy in town, kind of thing. So he's
not town.
Yes. Now, Edward, in the, we don't have a lot. His reign was very short. He died very young, but we do see him carrying on, attempting to look a bit like his father.
Almost a carbon copy, some of his clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And the stance he adopts as well, stands in just like Henry did.
Right. So you get that sense of, this is what the Tudor king, it changed from Henry VII to Henry VIII quite a bit. Edward seems to be, and again, we only get a little glimpse of his reign because it was short and he was young, but he seems, at least in what we do see, to be his father, carrying on a similar look to his father.
I mean, these were royal portraits, of course. They didn't go around like that all the time.
Right.
Really uncomfortable. But for the portraits, he had a lot to prove. He was only young. He had to give people the confidence that he would be as strong a king as his father was. Although some people might not have welcomed that idea.
Well, it's very interesting because he's trying, like you say, he's young and, he wants to be a big king and a grown-up, and you think of me as a grown-up king. So he does try and look like his father in some ways. And you mentioned the portraits, and that's another thing I wanted to bring up from your book, that these were very public images of the monarchs that are meant to impress people. So they wouldn't necessarily have gone around like that all the time, but for the portrait, they really want to be their very best selves. All right. Let's shift just a little to the royal women, because after those three kings, we have some women. First, Lady Jane Grey, very quickly, but then Mary and Elizabeth. So tell us a little bit about how they used fashion, because both of them had to sort of prove something. All the Tudors were trying to prove something. So Mary and Elizabeth were also trying to prove that as a woman, they could be the monarch. That was a new thing. They're the first crowned regnant queen. So how did they use fashion to reinforce their claim to the throne and their right to the throne?
I'm not really sure about Mary, to be honest. She's just obliterated by Elizabeth coming after as being so fantastic. I don't think I've even really looked at that aspect. But Elizabeth.
Okay, let's talk about Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. She knew about power dressing, didn't she? She was even from early on, you can see less of her, the woman. It's all clothes. Her face is just like a mask. If you look at the coronation picture, her face is just like a mask,
Mhm.
and she's just all this gold.
Right. Right.
And then later on, she got much blingier and bigger with massive ruffs and the huge sleeves and the cartwheel skirts. Just amazing. And the iconography that she used as well in her
Oh.
costumes, and the embroidery and the jewels. They all mean something in the portraits, at least.
Yes. So let's think about some of the portraits. You mentioned the coronation portrait, and what we see there is the amount of cloth of gold, right? So there's a smallish face, but all of this cloth of gold, all of this gold.
Yeah.
And as she goes on in her reign, you mentioned the bigger ruffs. So can you talk to us a little bit about what those ruffs? That was something we don't see at all in the early Tudors, but it really comes with Elizabeth. What's that ruff all about?
Just something I should have said about Mary's
Oh.
coronation gown is that Elizabeth actually recycled it. So it was Mary's, and then Elizabeth wore it afterwards. But the ruffs, yeah, they do start to come in towards the end of I don't know, Edward and Mary's time, but they're small, quite tiny. And under Elizabeth's reign, they just become ridiculous. I mean, sometimes they have to have like props holding them up, and a lady in waiting to make sure your ruff stayed up.
What was the point of the ruff? I mean, it's one thing when you think of the smaller ones, as you say, early on. So why did they grow the way they did?
I've no idea. Somebody must have said they were a good idea. I don't know. I suppose the Queen does it. Somebody copies. She's got to be better, so she makes hers bigger. I don't know, but there's all different sorts as well. There were flat ruffs and there were curly ones. Can't think what they're called, crimps.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bizarre.
Yeah, they are. And as starch becomes available, they can really stand out and stay stiff unless you get caught in a rainstorm. Now, with Elizabeth's, they almost take off behind her. So talk about how it's, it starts a little smaller with Elizabeth, and then by the end, there's like a whole thing happening behind her.
I think there's something else going on there. It's difficult to tell from the portraits, but I think that's not just a ruff. I think there's like a veil or something maybe attached to the ruff at the back. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert. I mean, I've written this book. I kept saying to the publisher, I'm not an expert. I don't know what to think about really. But they seem to think I did. So yes, they did. I mean, they did become ridiculous size cartwheel ruffs, but cartwheel to match the size of the cartwheel farthingale around their waist.
Right.
How they got anything done, I can't imagine.
Yeah, even going through a doorway would be so difficult. I read somewhere that now we can't get this from the portrait, but that as she moved, someone described that it would shimmer a little bit or just move just a little. So she almost looked like an otherworldly being, almost, floating as this contraption. It's not even really a ruff behind her, but as that all that contraption behind her was moving and shimmering as she moved. And in the candlelight, that was probably just beautiful and really made her stand out. It really made her stand out. And
beyond clothing, it's not just clothing, is it? It's something. It's like theatre.
Yes, that's a really good way to think about it. It is almost like a costume on a stage. And just like a costume on a stage is really bigger so that everybody in the back can see, I think there was some of that appearing by Elizabeth's time so that everyone could see that she was there, and that, she didn't have an air, so that she wanted to give this idea that she was always fine and healthy and moving around.
She was invincible.
Yes. All right. Now we've talked about the outside of the clothing, what about, you just mentioned this in passing, but tell us a little bit more about what's underneath the layers.
Well, there have been discoveries of what they think are medieval bras and knickers, but I'm very dubious about that, and not really. I haven't seen them in person. They don't look convincing to me. So when I dress, I've just got a shift, which is a linen, comes just below the knee, just like a dress really, but it's thin linen, good quality linen with lace trim. And what that served to soak up sweat and also to protect your outer garments from nastiness. So it's not very flattering, I have to say. So you just see the edge sometimes on the neckline. So then over the top of that, you then had your farthingale later on. Catherine of Aragon introduced that to England, which is like a cage petticoat, and it was a bell shape. It wasn't like a crinoline, so it wasn't like that. It was more like that. And what was I saying? Yeah, so that went there, and then your petticoats went on top of that, which was usually red, because they thought red had health-giving properties. And then your kirtle, which was like a pinafore dress, really, and they could either lace up the sides or lace up the back. Some of them laced up the front, and the theory is that the poorer people had them laced up the front and sides because they could do it themselves. Whereas if you were posh and you had a lady's maid, you had a back lacing one. But I don't know how true that is. And then the kirtle could be like your ordinary people would probably just have a linen or a woolen one, and that would be it. That's all they'd wear. And the grander ladies, they had the posh fabric at the front,
Right.
And then the cheaper fabrics that wouldn't be seen at the back, and then their top gown went over the top, which was as grand as the front of the kirtle, if you get what I mean. And then their sleeves and their hats. It takes about 45 minutes to get dressed, and that's if you know what you're doing.
Right. That would take a lot of training if you were going to work at court. Now, you mentioned a couple things I just want to make sure everybody understands. So the gown that goes on top, your final thing that goes on top, is the best fabric. It might be embroidered, or really, if you were wealthy, it could be patterned, but there were laws about different fabrics that you were allowed to wear based on your status. Is that right?
Lower class people, I mean, I bet I have my notes for this. Yeah, lower class people were prohibited from wearing certain silks and velvets and colours as well. You weren't allowed to wear purple if you were beneath a duke, I think it was. So they were, you got your peasants who were, there was a very thriving second-hand clothing market. So the lower down the scale you wore, the more people worn your clothes, basically. And so they would have been like homespun or wool, and then the higher up you got, the posher your fabric. But if you came into possession of a gown that was purple velvet with a silk lining, and you were low status, you couldn't wear it. So, but a lot of the posher gowns were left to people in wills. It's weird to us, doesn't it? I leave my daughter my best petticoat.
Yes, right. But clothing was very expensive. And so that would be a great gift then, even though it doesn't sound like it now. So one of the things, if you were not at the top, if you were not the queen, you might have less expensive fabric, except that piece in front that's going to show. and then your gown goes over that, and that's, you know, the very best goes on the outside.
They were very good at reworking their clothes as well into something, well, I suppose we still do, don't we? Into
Yes.
something more, not fashionable, but something more, say your mum had a gown and you were going to court, you might have her gown cut down. And Elizabeth did that too. So she was quite frugal, actually, considering, I did write a little note here. The last 4 years of her reign, she spent roughly £9,500 on her wardrobe. And yet in the first 5 years of James I's reign, he spent 36,000.
Okay, that's really interesting.
So you think, oh, £9,500 is quite a lot, but actually,
In comparison.
I said, hold my beer.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned also, and I think one thing that's really interesting is the sleeves are detachable. They are a separate piece.
Yeah, and usually you would make your sleeves and your petticoat, the front of your kirtle matching,
Mm-hmm.
so that you could interchange it with your top gown.
Right.
So it made it seem as if you had two outfits, when in actual fact you only had one and a few petticoats and sleeves.
Right. And so you could change the look of an outfit without buying an
Yeah,
entire new thing.
yeah.
And
There's
we
even, what's the name of it? There's even a thing they used to do where you just have that front triangle. You
Mm.
just wear that different.
Oh,
You
okay.
fix it to the inside of your top gown, like an apron. But you pin
Right.
it in place.
And a lot of pinning. So they talk about you wouldn't necessarily, not everything's already put together like our clothing.
Right.
You would pin bits in place, and then at the end of the day you'd have to unpin them all. And so there are loads in the account records, there are loads of, you know, payments for pins
That's
that
what
were
pin.
used. Yeah. Can you imagine? So that's another reason it took so long,
Yeah.
right, to get dressed.
What amazed me is that children and toddlers' clothes were also pinned. Can you imagine pinning your child into his clothes in the morning?
I don't think we do that today. Now, you wear these clothes, not the exact ones. You're not wearing the replicas, but you make and wear your own. So tell us a little bit, what happens when you put on clothing from a different era? Does it affect the way you walk? Does it affect the way you move? How do your arms and legs? I mean, tell us what it's like and how that helps you understand these people a little better.
Well, first of all, I should point out that I don't like clothes that touch me. So I don't like cuffs. I don't like waistbands. I don't like restriction. So I find them probably more uncomfortable than most people. But when I wrote my first novels, I used to have my women running and plumping down in a chair and just behaving quite normally. But then after I wore a gown, I realized that actually, if you drop something on the floor, you'd get someone else to pick it up. Because for a start, you can't see your feet, so you can't do your own shoes. You can't see because your skirt stands out. If you drop something, it's likely to end up underneath your skirt. So you need somebody else. Running's out the question. I mean, okay, I'm getting on, so maybe it's something to do with that. But yeah, you breathe differently. You don't tend to want to eat anything. So when we do a reenactment, sometimes we have breakfast, get laced into our gowns, and then we don't have anything to eat till dinner time, which is most unusual for me. But you just don't. I suppose all your belly's just got to swallow it, haven't you? What else? Yes, it does, and it makes you stand differently because you're kind of laced up and you're very upright in it. I mean, I dread to think what an Elizabethan gown must be like because I've never worn one of those. So, but I've worn the French gown. I can't even wear my French gown anymore. It's just become too. I've got arthritis in my shoulder, and it's just too uncomfortable. So I've got an English gown now, which is more comfortable. My black one. I don't know if you've seen pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And that is far more comfortable because it's like a large coat, so it just goes over your kirtle and you put it at the front, and it's easy to take on and off. Whereas your French gown, you're laced into it, and then your front bit is pinned on, and then you've got the sleeves, and the sleeves get stuck on everything. You knock your coffee.
Well,
I'm not really designed to wear posh clothes. I've gone as a peasant or a lower class woman, shall we say, a merchant's wife, and had more fun because your movement's so much freer in those sorts of clothes. Yes, I think I come from peasant stock anyway. I'm probably more suited to that.
well, most of us, I mean, if you look at society, I think most of us would probably be peasant stock. But I do think it's really interesting. So we might not get the really blingy, big, rough kinds of clothing to wear if we're peasant stock, but we would probably be a lot more comfortable because
style as well, because we still have that thing like people do today when they aspire to what Kate Middleton's wearing. Yeah, so they aspired to what the upper classes were wearing, but much simpler cut. Holbein's sketches that he did at court are quite good for showing what the rich people wore when they weren't on duty. So much less clothing. You know, they haven't got a big French hood or something. They've just got their coif, and I think they would be more comfortable.
That's it. That's interesting too, because when you were doing a big procession at court, and we heard from James Taff recently about sort of the Christmas court, and you absolutely wore your best because you're trying to catch somebody's eye. And so probably your movements were restricted and you weren't really able to eat and it wasn't all that comfortable. But when you went home around the house, you might look more like those Holbein sketches where it's a bit softer, just the coif, not that big headdress and not all those layers of heavy.
If you think about the coronation recently and how everybody was blinged up to the eyeballs.
Right.
And the Queen, you know, when the Queen went to an estate function, she would look so very poshest, opening a parliament, all that sort of thing. But at home, she was jumper skirt, headscarf, out with the horses, because that was what she was doing, suited the role. So it's similar, not quite the same.
It's not quite the same, but there are some similarities. And the clothing, you know, also is for your job in some ways. I mean, if you're the Queen, if you're Queen Elizabeth I or the second, you dress for this public position when it is in public. Yeah, you have those are your work clothes. If you're a peasant and you're working on the farm, your work clothes are very different. So it still sort of matches that.
And they would have had rougher linen and stuff that could be scrubbed. Because the only thing that got washed regularly would be your under your shift. And that would need a good scrubbing. And fine linen doesn't really take well to scrub in.
Right. And you can imagine the more jewels that were sewn into, and you can see in some of Elizabeth I's dresses, the jewels, the pearls that are sewn in, that's going to be very difficult to clean. So yeah, you don't want any wine around that because, you know, those stains would not come out. So what are some of your favorite things that you learned doing research, both for yourself in the clothing you make and for writing the book? What are some of the things that you found to be the most fun to learn about?
I enjoyed doing the children.
Okay.
Because I've had a lot of children myself, and I just can't imagine dealing with potty training, things like that. I mean, no matter what status, I mean, at least if you're high status, you just hand the kids over to the nurse, don't you? But lower status women, how did they deal with their linen and the washing, the amount of washing you get? Because, you know, they haven't got Pampers.
Right.
So every time they wet, they must have wet right through. So what did they do? How did they deal with the washing and keeping them out of the fire and things like that?
Well, that is interesting to think about children and how you would dress them, to keep them healthy and comfortable-ish at least. And yeah.
There's a lovely Holbein sketch, lady on a bench or something like that, and she's got her children with her who are all dressed like Henry. So in his coat and hat, and I, I just think, how did you keep them clean?
Yeah. Yes. That would be quite a challenge, even with a lot of household help. Kids get into things, so keeping them clean.
The clothing was so expensive. I mean, I've taken my kids to weddings and they've got absolutely filthy and food all down them, and their stuff could just go in the washer. So how this woman managed, I think she's got 3 boys with her. It's a lovely sketch. I really like Holbein's sketches.
Yes. But it does open a window into some of the things we wonder about when we think of these people, as mothers with children, and you've spent a great deal of money on these clothes for this portrait or for this activity or for this Christmas court. You want your family to make a good impression. How do you keep your children from getting so filthy because their clothes can't go into the wash? So it really, thinking about it through the clothing really does help us remember that even though times change, people really don't. And there are still children running around and mothers trying to keep them clean and budgeting for new clothing when they start wearing out of things or growing out of things. All of those things are still part of this.
That's that story about Henry VIII when he was young and he was at a court function, and his dad obviously wanted him to be on his best behavior. Sorry about that. And then when it came to the dancing, he threw off his coat and danced in his shirt sleeves. I bet his dad was going, Henry.
You're right, but that account is written up by several people who visited, and they didn't seem all that appalled. They thought it was kind of fun, but I think he was only about 10. So that sounds like something a 10-year-old would take off this restrictive coat so he could really dance and enjoy himself. So sometimes even at the top, they're behaving like that. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a treat to think about the clothing and how people at the top, the kings and queens, sort of used clothing, but also, all people down to the, those who are working in the fields and everything, they have to clothe themselves, and the way they do it's affected by their lives, and it really does affect their lives. So dressing like a Tudor. So How to Dress Like a Tudor by Judith is available on
hints and tips in the back to make your own Tudor clothes.
Great. I was going to ask about that. So for those of us who want more and more and want to make our own, there are some tips, and you don't have to necessarily these days have the finest, fabric, but you can really make it look fun and have that experience and see how it does affect the way you move and the way you stand. You mentioned being laced up and how it does, sort of change the way you behave sometimes. So thank you so much. Now, how can we follow you on social media? Tell us where you are and how we can follow you.
I'm everywhere.
You're everywhere. And I will share all the links. So now you've written a lot of, this nonfiction, but you've also written a lot of fiction. And so tell us now, what are you working on? Are you working on some more fiction, some more nonfiction? What are you working on now?
Between books at the moment. I just launched the 3rd in my trilogy about Henry VIII. And I'm having a little break because I lived 4 years with Henry in my house, talking to me, waking me up in the night. And it's quite a difficult one, especially the last book when things get really dark, because I'm writing it from his point of view. So
okay.
You get his take on what happened. And he was really, really quite difficult to deal with for so long. So I'm quite glad to have that off my chest. And I don't know, I might go back to the Middle Ages, the Wars of the Roses, maybe. I haven't quite decided next.
Well, we'll keep an eye on what you're doing, and we'd love to have you back to talk about some of the fiction as well. I think it's really great that for right now, because you told us about starting with Henry VIII and how he just really got you captivated into the time period, and you were young and that was sort of your first, and now you've studied so much that he's in your head talking to you in the middle of the night. So you can really get involved with Henry VIII.
I do like the more difficult characters. I did his grandmother before. I did Margaret Beaufort trilogy, and I've written about Mary the First, most of his wives now, and so I think maybe go back to the Wars of the Roses.
Well, they have some really great characters there. So we'll look forward to those. And thank you so much for joining us. It's really been fun to think about these figures we think we know so well through their clothing and how they were positioning themselves in different ways, especially the monarchs. And thank you everyone for listening. Really appreciate your being here, and stay tuned because there's lots more coming up.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. If you would subscribe wherever you are on listening or on YouTube, leave a rating and maybe share with a friend. And please plan to join us next time as we keep shaking up history together.